This is one in a series of interviews conducted by the U.S. Air Force Historical Division in conjunction with the Air Force Office of Information. I'm Lieutenant Bert Case, an information officer with the Continental Air Command. These interviews are part of an oral history program intended to record important aspects of the history of the Air Force as seen by the men who helped to make the Air Force. Through these interviews, we hope to capture and preserve information that will not only provide documentation, but also serve as a source of inspiration to the men and women of the Air Force. Today, we're interviewing Lieutenant General Edward J. Timberlake, a man who's had 34 years in the United States Air Force and is retiring after a distinguished career. He's the commander of the Continental Air Command. General Timberlake, after graduating from West Point in 1931, you went to flying training at Kelly Field, Texas, I believe.
Just as quickly as I could.
Did you think at that time that you would make this a career?
I had always wanted to be an aviator. I didn't realize it was going to last this long. You see, my father was in the Army, graduate at West Point. My three brothers went to West Point before me, so naturally it was sort of natural that I go there. And while there, I took a look at the various services, and the only one that looked attractive to me was the then Air Corps.
What particular aspect attracted you to the Air Corps?
I just wanted to fly airplanes, that's all. We didn't have a mission in those days as we do now. We had things known as bombers and pursuit planes and attack planes. But we were just a part of the Army, really, and it was just the thought of flying an airplane just intrigued me, and that's what I wanted to do.
Could you single out one individual who's had the most influence on your career, sir?
Well, this is difficult, but I would say I would nominate General Ira Aker. This happened many years later after I graduated from West Point. It was in World War II. I had taken a group over to England in the 8th Air Force, and I was a rather low-ranking colonel. General Aker gave me a few things to do, jobs to do, and apparently I did them to his satisfaction because he nominated me for a brigadier general in 1943, which put me from the bottom of the heap pretty much toward the top. And I would say that this had as much to do with my career, whatever it's worth, as anyone I know of.
General Timberlake, I realize this is a very hard question, but what would you consider your most significant contribution to the Air Force?
I don't think I could answer that question. I don't know of a single contribution. I don't know of hardly if anyone else can say what the most important thing they did. I just can't answer that one, really.
All right, sir. What would you consider to be your most interesting and satisfying assignment?
I would say without doubt it was to command when I took over the command of the 93rd Bomb Group. At that time, it wasn't a bomb group. It was just a bunch of people we had gotten together. And I was its first commander. I organized it. We moved over to England. It was a good outfit. We moved to Africa twice, back to England. They flew Lord knows how many missions over Germany and all around Europe. It was something that I saw develop, and I thought I had something to do with it, and I think that was it.
You took it over. This
That's
would
right.
be the main reason you say this.
That's right. I formed it, that's it.
What would you say your most difficult decisions have been throughout your entire military career, sir?
I really don't think I've had to make difficult decisions. Usually, in the military, decisions are made for you. You have minor decisions to make as to whether to go down this fork of the road or that fork of the road. I believe the decision you make is to get the decision and then do with it what you can. Make it work out the best you can.
Between 1936 and 1940, General Timberlake, you were an instructor in various types of aircraft down at Kelly Field in Texas. What were the major problems you encountered as an instructor there, and how did you go about solving them?
Well, there weren't really major problems. The difficult part there was that we didn't have the art of instructing as sophisticated as it is now. In other words, they sort of grabbed somebody out of a squadron and sent them to San Antonio and said, "You're an instructor." as a result, it was every man for himself, more or less, and we didn't have any real standards to go by. It was rather interesting, though, because you felt that you and your students were competing against another instructor and his students, and if yours could do better, then you felt as much better off. It was quite interesting.
What about the major problems of the Air Corps per se during this period?
In the latter 1930s?
In the 30s, yes, sir.
Well, we had lots of problems. I guess the most important was try to impress on the then War Department and the Army of the terrific potential that the Air Corps had, the potential for air power as we now know it. There were a lot of non-believers in those days. There was that, and then it was the fight to get equipment. As I recall, it took many, many years to convince the Army and the War Department that the B-17 was a worthwhile airplane. Many of the Army and the War Department felt that this was too big a thing to use, that you didn't need this much. We also had organizational pains. We didn't quite know which way we wanted to go in the Air Corps. Then, when the expansion started along 37, 38, 39, we found we were organizing units and groups and air forces, but we didn't have many people who had had command experience. So we had to develop people from, really pull them out of the cockpit and say, you're a commander, bud, and get with it. These are problems that happen to any organization that's in a growing pains, you know.
Then you think that the Air Force was definitely justified, of course, in its emphasis on the long-range bomber, such as the B-17.
Oh, yes. It had to, there was no other way to, people didn't realize that there was going to be the magnitude of the war, and they didn't realize just what the bomber could do, and to the extent of destroying the enemy's will to fight. And I think this was ably demonstrated both in the European theater and in the Pacific.
Did you foresee World War II at this time? What were your feelings about this? How did you think the course of history would go in the next 5 or 6 years?
Well, at that time, I wasn't much of a student of history. I mean, a student of political facts of life. I really, when the war started in Europe, between, when Hitler started that war against Europe, against France and England, I thought at that late date that the Allies would take him. But I was wrong on that one, as I've been wrong on other things. I didn't foresee a war such as it came out, and I doubt if many other people did.
Well, in this period where the concentration was on the long-range bomber, the B-17 in particular, what happened to the fighter aircraft? What was the thinking of the period as to fighter aircraft?
Well, I think really we might have oversold ourselves in the Air Corps at that time, but we gave the impression that the bomber A could bomb in a pickle barrel, as they used to say. That B, because we had a lot of guns around the thing, that it was invincible to enemy attack. Well, A was wrong. We couldn't bomb in a pickle barrel. We could put bombs around the pickle barrel, and we could destroy it ultimately. And the bomber could not live in an atmosphere that had a good air defense and a good ground anti-aircraft environment. Therefore, they didn't pay too much attention to the long-range fighter. During the early part of of the World War II, daylight raids against Germany, our losses were pretty high. And it was then they decided to put some legs on the fighter. They put the tanks on the P-51. They got the P-38 over there. They put some tanks on the P-47s. Then they could take the bombers all the way into Berlin. And I've always felt that whatever credit was given to the bombers for the air assault against Germany, that the fighters should be given at least equal credit for that, because we couldn't have done it without them.
Any particular fighter?
Well, I liked them all. They just look wonderful up there. The most beautiful thing you've ever seen flying around.
I can imagine so. If we might regress just a moment here, General. What were some of the major difficulties you encountered? You were a bombardment squadron commander at the period just prior to World War II. What were some of your major difficulties during the period of rearmament for the war?
Well, the way you made groups in those days, you started off with one group and you'd cut it in two, You made two groups from it, and then you took each of these two groups and you cut it into two, and you made two groups from that, and you went on down the line. This is how you expanded the Air Force. Well, I guess I took over the one that had received the fourth cut. In other words, I got about 20% of the people you'd normally have in a group, and all the rest we had were brand new recruits. But the cadre, this 20% cadre, were such magnificent people that it didn't take too long to whip the unit into shape. We had troubles then because, for example, in my particular unit, we went from, started off with B-17s, got going along pretty good with that. We went into B-24s and back to B-17s and ultimately ended up with B-24s. Nothing major, nothing you can't accomplish, you can't complete. It's just a little frustrating at times, but you saw yourself, your unit, and the whole Air Force sort of growing up together, and we just had growing pains, that's all.
The transition from one aircraft to the other, then you would say was
right.
the major thing.
It was a little difficult.
Well, on a personal basis, sir, what were some of the most interesting experiences you had prior to World War II?
Oh, I think, from a personal point of view, it was my very first assignment in the Air Corps in Hawaii. But I think probably the most interesting part of World War II was being an instructor at Kelly Field. It was not only interesting then, but to see the students that I was responsible to see how the technique of flying, to see them develop in later years, it gave you sort of a little boost.
What about San Antonio at that time? How did people feel about the field out there and about air power in general, the people you talked with in town, say?
Well, they always called San Antonio the mother-in-law of the Air Corps, I guess, and I think it's quite true. They've always had a very favorable attitude, and they always seem to be ahead of things down in San Antonio. When Randolph Field was first built as the head of the center of the training establishment, San Antonio gave its full support. It's a very fine city and still is.
During World War II, you became a very noted wartime leader, General Timberlake. The 93rd Bomb Group, which you've already mentioned, was known as Ted's Flying Circus. Which action or campaign conducted by one of your commands do you consider to be the most significant?
Well, I would say it ended up with the Plesty low-level attack. However, again, I'd like to go back to the 93rd Group. When this group was organized, as I recall, we had 5 officers who had had previous experience as regular officers. We had about 20 non-coms. All the rest of them were brand new. We were getting these brand new pilots with a minimum amount of time, 200 to 300 hours, putting them in a 4-engine airplane. We were getting former automobile mechanics, and they were becoming line chiefs, and they just developed awfully rapidly. Once we got to Europe, as I mentioned, General Aker gave me a few problems. One day he called me in and asked how long it would take to get down to North Africa. This was just after the North African invasion. And being a little on the cocky side, I said, well, we can get down there in 2 days. He thought it'd take a week, and sure enough, we got there in 2 days. We operated out of Africa for 3 months, out of North Africa. Then we moved over to Libya, then back to England, stayed there about 6 months or so, and then back down again together with some other United Kingdom-based groups to get ready for the Plesty show. So it was the association with the 93rd Group leading up to the Plesty show, I think, that
was most
significant as far as I know.
What were the major problems that any World War II commander had to face, and in particular, you as a World War II commander?
Well, the problems varied as the war went on. For instance, when we first went over, no one had any idea of the attrition rate that would be experienced. You just couldn't forecast this, and as a result, we were not getting replacement crews. And during the first 3 or 4 months in 1942, that is from September up to December of 42, we were losing crews and there were no replacements. And you'd go in a barracks which would normally hold, say, 40 or 50 pilots and co-pilots and navigators. and you'd find 3 or 4 in there. Well, this isn't a great morale-building factor, and it was hard to impress on the youngsters then that replacements were coming, and they did. They began coming in 1943, and then the tide swung the other way. We began really getting more crews than we had airplanes, so then it was hard to parcel out the missions so that they'd come out about the same. Then the airplanes caught up with the crews, and along toward the last, instead of having a group of, we had 4 squadrons with 8 airplanes per squadron, about 32 airplanes. We ended up with, I think it was around 60 to 75 airplanes per group with about 100 crews. So then it became a problem of magnitude rather than as it was in the beginning. So those were the sort of problems we had.
You mentioned, sir, that decisions in the military, you think you decide which road you go down, but most of the major decision is made elsewhere. What would you consider the most important decision you made during World War II?
Again, I can't pick out a particular decision that had a lot to do with myself or from a personal point of view or the Air Force.
Perhaps Ploesti.
Well, I didn't make the decision. Somebody else made the decision that we were going to hit Ploesti, so then my decision was, well, this doesn't look very good, but we better do what we can with it and develop the best tactics you can. So if that's a decision, then that would be a very important one. I think I've been fairly fortunate in being able to pick out a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, and if you can pick out the right way to things to do and then do them, then I guess you'd call that a decision.
Well, let's go to the Ploesti or Ploesti, which is...
Ploesti.
Ploesti. All right, sir. Of course, that was a major event of the air war in World War II. Could you describe the planning for Ploesti?
The planning was absolutely meticulous, except for one thing, and that was the intelligence of the anti-aircraft guns, the ground weapons they had around Ploesti. For example, we had people who had lived in Ploesti, oil engineers, English oil engineers, develop absolute scale models for all of the refineries that we were going to hit. We had these scale models put down on the ground, photographs taken so that they'd see them as the pilot would see them coming in. We took the town of Ploesti and the 6, I think, refineries right around it, and we built an absolute model in the deserts in Libya. And we would have our formations maneuver on dry runs. We did this for months ahead of time. The crews knew precisely where their bomb was supposed to go. The planning, as I say, was meticulous. We had broken the German weather code, and we knew what the weather. Matter of fact, the day we went was because of this, because we had not broken it for the following cycle. They changed it every quarter, and this was the last day we could pick on the weather. However, we did not have the intelligence as to the amount of defenses they had around there, and as a result, we lost a lot more airplanes.
Could you describe a typical, one of the raids, what it was like as the aircraft went in, the actual execution of the Ploesti mission?
Well, the idea was to try to hit these, I believe it's 6 refineries right around Ploesti, plus another one up north, to try to hit all of these refineries simultaneously with 150 airplanes we had. So you had to maneuver your planes, your groups, so that when they made their turn, they would be practically abreast, each of them with an individual target. There was a mistake in navigation, and the lead group did not go to its target, and this caused some later confusion. But those groups that maneuvered perfectly went up to a railroad. They went beyond that point, turned right. This then put them in a more or less line abreast. They then had their individual targets to hit. They went in right on the deck, and I mean right on the deck. It was 50 to 150 feet. And we dropped, the bomb arrangement was right interesting. We wanted to keep the bombs going on for 24 hours. So we had a few bombs. You had to have a delay in the bombs, of course. we had a few bombs that would go off. I think it was a 5 or 10-second delay to allow the airplane to escape. Then about 25 to 30% of the bombs had a 3-hour delay. About the same percentage had a 6-hour delay. And then the rest of them had a 24-hour delay, up to 24 hours. Our thought was to make it embarrassing for the workers who were going to try to fix the refinery to have these things popping off all the time, and apparently it worked pretty well.
In light of this experience at Palesti, what are your views on the employment of heavy jet bombers at extremely low altitudes?
Well, it's something that I think you're going to have to do, because a bomber with the very sophisticated radar ground equipment that is now in existence, plus the rockets that they have, anti-aircraft rockets, plus the thought of arming these rockets with nuclear warhead, it's going to be kind of tough to be sitting up there at 35, 40,000 feet making a run into Moscow. Now, you can take these bombers in under the radar screen. They have means of navigating fairly accurately. And if they can avoid the accurate ground defenses, such as we did around Palesti, I believe they can get away with it. But I think it's a mistake to believe that this is going to be a free run. It's going to be a pretty expensive run. But frankly, I believe it's about the only way it can be done and get the number of aircraft you want to hit the target.
What do you think about the importance of strategic bombing in World War II, sir?
Well, I think it was extremely important. I think it had a terrific amount to do with the capitulation of Germany and Japan. However, in the case of Europe, we really didn't do as much strategic bombing as everyone believes. We were called a strategic bomber. But actually, I remember the figures, but I did know the figures once, but I can't remember them now. I would say that if 50% of our bombing was pure strategic bombing, that this might be a high figure, because we were doing, to use semantics, a lot of what I would call tactical bombing. For instance, we put the whole heavy force around Normandy for months before the invasion of Normandy, hitting the bridges and getting the roads, getting the airfields, and getting that sort of thing. When the German V-2 weapon first came into play on the peninsula there, we spent 4 or 5 months doing nothing but getting after V-2 because we had to protect the base in England, London. We did a lot of this sort of work, which you can't say is pure strategic bombing. That is going after the enemy's source of industry. I say oil, their refineries is strategic, communications is strategic, transportation is strategic, the ball bearing attacks were strategic. But really, something less than 50% probably was put on pure strategic bombing. But what it did do was definitely knock out the Germans' capability to regroup and form up again and come back.
Do you think the Army Air Force faith in daylight bombing was justified?
Yes, I certainly do, because one, from the results, and two, it kept the attack going over Germany 24 hours a day, because the RAF, the British bombers, were a night outfit, and they would be coming back from their raids when we'd be forming up in the morning to go on over. It kept the thing going all the time. I think this was much better than work at night. Now, again, it's my impression that General Aker was the one that really forced this decision, because the RAF didn't believe that the Americans could live over Europe in daylight. And at the meeting at Casablanca, President Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill attended. At that time, they were going to decide whether the Americans were going to switch over to a night, being a night force with the British, or what. I wasn't there, but it's my understanding that General Aker, with the support of General Arnold, made the case for the daylight bombing for the American bombers, and it proved out successfully.
You thoroughly agreed with it in every aspect.
I sure did. It was a little awkward at times, but...
What do you consider to be the major lesson of World War II, General Timberlake?
Major lesson of World War II.
Quite a few.
Let's take a look at this purely from the tactical military side, and forgetting the political things. The major lesson, I think the average military person is apt to overestimate what his weapon can do. Prior to World War II, if you had told the average officer in the Air Corps that it was going to take raids of 1,000, 1,500 heavy bombers to put out a particular target and probably go back there time after time, they would have laughed at you. But this proved correct. You couldn't just send one group out and expect it to destroy an airfield. You had to send probably 3 times that many, not because we were inaccurate, but just because the natural resilience of man and equipment and facilities that they build. So I think the one lesson I learned is don't overestimate your capability and allow for that in your planning.
On a personal basis, sir, what do you consider your most interesting experience in World War II?
Setting aside specific missions like those, I would say forming the 20th Combat Wing. At that time, we had the Air Force, then you had a division, and then under the division you had the groups. Well, we built up to under the division, there'd be, say, 15 groups, and the span of control was too great. So they formed what they call combat wings, and I happened to be the person picked to form the first one, the 20th. Now, what we did then is form a small headquarters, 20, 25 officers, about the same number of airmen, and tie 3 groups to this intermediate headquarters. And then this headquarters carried out the instructions of the division. What it amounted to was a field extension of higher headquarters, so you could get out and personally see what the bombardiers were doing and the gunners were doing and the pilots were doing, the mechanics were doing, and so forth. Being the first one organized in Europe, I was rather interested in this. It worked out, and finally the 8th Air Force went to that system.
Immediately after the war, General Timberlake, you served as the Assistant Chief of Staff for Personnel of Continental Air Forces. What were the major problems of this period in personnel and organization particularly?
Well, that was demobilization day, wasn't it?
Right.
The demobilization right after World War II was to be handled by the Army. Suddenly they found these hundreds of thousands of people that had to be returned home. It got too big for them, so they turned over that portion of the demobilization to the then still Air Corps, United States Air Corps. This got a little big for the Pentagon, and one morning over our headquarters then Bowling Field, we got this telephone call and said, as of noon today, you are responsible for the demobilization of, I forget the numbers, 560,000 or some tremendous amount of Air Corps personnel. Well, this was something we hadn't planned for, and we had to move pretty quickly, but apparently it worked all right. We got them out, and then at the time we were getting these people out, the planners were already working together about building units back up again, because we then saw the threat of the USSR. So on the one hand, you were deactivating, you were demobilizing individuals, and on the other hand, you were trying to build up new units. We concentrated on what is now known as Strategic Air Command, and I think a pretty good job was done, because within 2 or 3 years, SAC was back on its feet and has been the major deterrent power of the air of the United States, or free world rather, ever since that time. But it was demobilization and reactivation occurring at the same time. Right.
Major problem. In 1948, you became the commanding general of an air division in Japan, then Chief of Staff and Vice Commander of the 5th Air Force. How would you assess the preparedness of the Far East Air Forces when the Korean War broke out in 1950?
Well, if you limit it to the Far East Air Force, you get one story. If you limit it, if you encompass the whole national defense posture, you get another story, because at that time, the popular thought was that we were not only big enough, or maybe too big, and there was a decrease in the overall national military effort. But in the Far East, we had a different problem as far as the Air Force goes. The Far East Air Force had one single mission, and that was air defense. We didn't have the tactical mission. We didn't practice air-to-ground gunnery. We didn't have any forward air controllers. We didn't operate with the Army, because air defense was one thing, and the Army had a police mission, Japan, occupation mission. Then, when the Korean War started, on the 25th of June, on the 26th of June, we suddenly found that our groups and our wings were no longer air defense wings. They were now tactical wings. They had the offensive mission and had to learn how to drop bombs and napalm and rockets and that sort of thing. And there wasn't any training period for this. We trained right in Korea. That transition, I must say, to the credit of the kids that were flying the airplanes then, went very rapidly. And within 2 weeks' time, you would have thought that they'd been doing that all their life.
Weren't prepared for a tactical mission versus a defense mission.
That's right.
What were the principal problems, would you say, of the Air Force during the first year of the Korean War?
Well, they were varied. The first part of the first year.
That certainly would be one.
Yes, I mean, in July and August of 1950, there was a problem of cooperating with the Army. And unfortunately, the Army didn't quite understand how they were supposed to operate in our joint endeavors against the Koreans. We formed a joint operations center in the headquarters of the 5th Air Force, and the Army didn't participate. They thought they were supposed to have a JOC. Well, anyhow, after about 2 months, General Partridge, who commanded the 5th Air Force, and General Walker, who commanded the 8th Army, got together, ironed this thing out. We then were able to demonstrate our capabilities based on the Army's requirements. And from that time on, the coordination between the two went very smoothly. About that time, though, we were making an advance up we continued playing yo-yo up and down Korea, go up and back and up and back. But this, we were going up, and our logistic lines were getting longer and longer. We had very poor roads. We had non-existing railroads. We were supplying our aircraft with fuel and ammunition from Japan. We were also converting from propeller jobs to jets. The amount of fuel that a jet squadron uses is something like 3 times the magnitude of what a propeller squadron uses, because it does more sorties back and forth. So logistics then became the big problem during, say, from September up until the spring of 1951. By that time, the lines had stabilized a little bit, and we got our logistics in shape. Then the next problem was that, frankly, we began to run out of targets. We had destroyed everything of military value, and most of it from that time on became armed reconnaissance. I left in July of 1951, so I can't speak for the rest of the time.
How would you describe our relations prior to your leaving with the South Koreans and the other allies, for that matter, during the first year?
Excellent. As far as the South Koreans go, the then president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, would come over to our evening planning conferences, our JOC, where we met with the Army and decide what we're going to do the next day. He came over 2 or 3 times a week. Their opposite number to our Secretary of Defense would do the same thing. The chief of the Korean Air Force was over there practically every night. We trained, we gave the Koreans some P-51s, and we trained their crews right in Korea. The relationship was absolutely splendid. As with the other allies, we had Australian squadron. We had a few airplanes from other countries, and I can't recall them right now. The Australians were the big donators. They did a splendid job. We worked them right in with our fighters. Matter of fact, we made them a 4th squadron of one of our fighter wings. They did fine. We worked closely with the Navy. We got so we worked closely with the Army. It was a... I only wish that somebody could take a still picture of how things were going in Korea in the spring of 1951 and make that a blueprint of how services and nations can cooperate in a single endeavor. If they could have made a blueprint of this thing and then adopted it from that time on, I think all these little doctrinaire problems that we've had since then would have been washed out the window.
What was the key to that, sir?
Well, I think the key really was the two basic commanders, the commanders you had over there, the Army commander and the Air Force commander. General Partridge is probably one of our greatest airmen. We had General Walker and General Ridgway, and I can't remember the succession right now. And here they were on this peninsula. They had one common goal, and that was to defeat the enemy, and they used their weapons and their people and their materiel together in a coordinated manner to do this. And this is what it amounted to. And there was no doctrinaire quibbles. There was no quibbles about, well, the Army should do this bombing, the Air Force should do this bombing. The Air Force had the airplanes, and they did the bombing what the Army wanted. There was no doctrinaire problems between the Air Force and the Navy, simply because we had one job to do and everybody did it. Didn't have time to think about these funny problems they create.
Key was having a mission and going to it. This was it. Do you think it's a safe statement, General Timberlake, that without air power, the United Nations forces would have been driven from the Korean Peninsula?
I sure do, and I don't depend on my own judgment for that statement. General Walker, the commander of the 8th Army, just after our breakout around the Naktung area there, wrote a letter back to General MacArthur and said without the support of the Air Forces, his armies would have had to evacuate.
Do you think we should have gone north and bombed the Manchurian bases, for example?
To the life of me, I never have understood why we didn't. I think really some people thought that if we went across the Yalu River and what was sacred about it, I don't know, and got those airplanes up there and got the source of where the people were when the Chinese got anything, that this would involve China in the war. Well, China wasn't about to get in any overt war at that time. Then they said, well, it might involve Russia in a general war. Well, Russia wasn't about to get in any war then. We had the atomic weapons. We could have gone up there and done anything we wanted to and moved that, kept the Chinese, prevented them from supporting the troops in North Korea, and it would have been done at a very low cost, I believe.
You would have even gone to Communist China?
Sure.
Did the U.S. Air Force experience in Korea, you think, support its views at that time on tactical air power?
Yes. A lot of people don't understand tactical air power. It's really a tactical air or theater air force, air power, is a composite air force. It's a bomber outfit, it's a reconnaissance outfit, it's air defense, it's night. It's everything in an air force compacted into a small field organization. And its one problem, one job, is the defeat of the enemy in coordination with the Army. This is what it's there for. And we demonstrated that this could work. We used common communications. We knew what each side, the Army knew what we could do, we knew what they wanted, and we did it. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't have any doctrinaire problems then. There was no service jealousies over there, and as a result, I think it is a shining example how it could go if people were willing to make it go. Since that time, the Army, Air Force problems have been blown up from time to time, but I feel sure that even today, if we got into a conflict such as that they would throw out all these problems of policies and theories, and they would work just as well as they did in Korea.
General Timberlake, in September 1951, you became the 9th Air Force Commander, a post you held for 6 years. What were the major problems and achievements during this period?
Well, I'm terrifically proud of that assignment. I did command it for 6 years. I say this without trying to break my arm by patting myself on the back, but First of all, we had about, as I recall, we got up at one time to 13 bases spread around the United States. And on these 13 bases, we had some 16 fighters, reconnaissance planes, wings, and so forth. So the span of control was pretty big. In 1951, the 9th Air Force was a propeller-driven Air Force. We didn't have any jets. 6 years later, we had converted all of these wings into jets, which is quite a transition time. We went from the 86s to the F-100s. We had an idea, which is later proven good, that you could support Europe and the Far East by sending your fighter squadrons in groups directly to Europe, directly to the Far East, by using in-flight refueling. A lot of people didn't believe this could be done. Well, we had to sell this point and then demonstrate it, and we did. And along about 1954, 55, in there, we began sending regularly squadrons over to Europe and then later on over to the Far East, and this is a common practice now. You hear of it being done as a routine thing. All of these changes were pretty much of high magnitude. I had a tremendous group of people working with me in the 9th Air Force. It was a wonderful headquarters. The people were great. My wing commanders were outstanding. I had fine support from Tactical Air Command, and it was a most enjoyable tour of duty.
What are your views concerning the effectiveness of the CASAF concept?
Well, again, this was developed in the 9th Air Force, and we organized the first, the 19th Air Force was to be the nucleus of the CASAF. I still think it's a good idea, but the application somehow or other has gone off on a tangent. What we wanted to do was develop a small, streamlined headquarters, attach, not assign, certain elements of our units, fighter bombers, reconnaissance, and so forth, to it, so that in case of an emergency in Europe or the Far East, you could move this headquarters together with this attached unit and send an entity over to those countries. The idea is still good, but in Europe and in the Far East, they already have a command organization there, and the commanders in both USAFE and PACAF are loath to have another command added onto them. So what we've done is when we send a CASAF to Europe, they eliminate the headquarters and just assign the squadrons and groups around as individuals. So you can't apply it really to a theater that already has a command organization. I would say it could be well applied to an area where there is no existing command and control system. For instance, during the Lebanon crisis, at that time I was in USAFE, the 19th Air Force came over with 3 groups, as I recall, and we did allow the 19th Air Force assume command, kept command of his units and ran them from Aden in Turkey.
Well, this leads us to a very difficult question, General Timberlake. What do you think the proper roles of the Army and Air Force are in counterinsurgency operations, particularly in respect to Vietnam?
Well, I tell you, as I see counterinsurgency, the principles are the same as any joint endeavor by the Army and the Air Force. The principle is the same that happened in Korea, to a different degree of magnitude, admittedly. But it seems to me, again, over in Vietnam, for the first part of the war there, we had a question of the Army, unfortunately, getting into the doctrine business. They wanted to take over more of the air effort. They didn't have a really joint command. I think this has been straightened out to a large extent. However, to answer your question, I believe that your method of operation is exactly the same as that has been developed throughout the year. That is the coordination between the Army and the Air Force. You simply modify it depending on the existing circumstances at a particular place where you're fighting.
You think it's been done properly in Vietnam?
No, I don't. Not up to now. I think it's getting better. And maybe the Air Force is a little at fault here because really, as I see Vietnam, it's a question, the problem there is to occupy ground. And the thing that I think that the Air Force should do is do everything they can to help the ground forces occupy ground. I believe that the Air Forces are doing that now. On the other hand, I believe the Army didn't want the Air Force to help them at first. Now they do, and it's getting better all the time.
Well, do you believe that the recent buildup in general purpose forces is tending to degrade the strategic deterrent concept?
No, I think the strategic concept is valid and will continue to be valid. I believe that it is entirely possible, however, that you could, I'm not saying that the strategic buildup is too big. I'm saying it's possible that it could be too big. I think there's a finite amount of effort you should have in a strategic effort, and we should take into consideration not only what the Air Force does through its flying machines, through its missiles, but what the Navy can do with its Polaris. I believe that it's entirely possible that the Strategic Air Command will never fire a bullet in anger, and I hope this is true, because then they've done their job. They're a deterrent. On the other hand, it seems to me that in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to have a number of Viet Congs, Vietnams. And it's the general purpose forces, as they are now popularly called, will be used in these types of engagements. And it's these engagements that are going to keep the image of America being strong and willing to fight for freedom throughout the world. It's these units that are going to do it, and they're going to do it because SAC is furnishing this umbrella that allows them to go out and operate. So there's a very careful balance here. TAC for a long while was a victim of low priorities. I think this has changed, and I think it's getting more in balance now.
Well, in the period of the middle 50s, do you think, evidently you do, from that comment, that too much emphasis was placed on strategic forces at the expense of the tactical?
I don't quite say it, and this may sound like I'm walking around the problem. I don't know that there's a magic number, a percentage that can be used as the gross national product to building up the military forces. I think probably the amount and the effort and the priority given to SAC at that time was correct. I think that the priorities given to tactical type air forces was not enough. I'm not saying it should be taken away from here and put over here. I simply think that the more should have been put into the general purpose forces during that time.
In that particular time. In 1957, sir, you went to Europe, becoming the commander of the 4th Allied Tactical Air Force, and a year later as the vice commander of USAFE. What were the major problems and achievements in this period?
Well, that NATO assignment was really interesting, that 4th Tactical Air Force. We had the French and the Canadians and the Americans and the Germans. And as commander of the NATO force, I did not have operational control of these units in peacetime. My mission read that I would train these units. I would see that these units were trained so that they could take over their wartime mission. Now, when an emergency developed, if we had a war, then the Americans, the Canadians, and the French and the Germans would have come under the control of the 4th ATAF, and then we would have fought them. So it was a peculiar situation where you were going to fight units, but you didn't control them in peacetime. Therefore, a new method of command had to be established. You couldn't go out and point the finger and say, you do this. You had to use the approach that, don't you think it would be a fine idea if you kept 8 of your airplanes on the alert here and we tied in the communications this way? You did it by trying to convince them more than anything else, and it worked because when we had maneuvers, then the 4th ATAF ran the maneuvers. We had no trouble at all, so it was a very interesting experience.
Same type thing, of course, in USAFE, but on a lesser degree.
That's right. Well, of course, USAFE does not belong to NATO.
Sure.
But
must work with them.
It must work, the same idea.
Do you believe that there should be greater participation by our European allies in the nuclear decision, control of nuclear weapons.
I've always thought so. I can't understand how we can say, well, we're your allies. We have this weapon. We don't quite trust you in using this weapon. I think you either have an ally or you don't have an ally. If you have an ally, then you enter into free interchange of ideas and equipment and get the maximum out of what each has.
Do you think we should actually assign nuclear weapons to each country in NATO?
I think it could be done. I would be selective about it. I don't think it's a mandatory thing. We give it to everybody. Some of the countries some of the European countries aren't capable of doing the maintenance. They don't have the type of airplanes that can deliver them. But certainly our relationship with the United Kingdom is such that they ought to have all the weapons to use them just as we do.
What about the European portion of shaping other policies other than nuclear in NATO? Do you think that the other countries are given enough?
Well, when I was over there, and prior to when I was over there, of course, the whole strategy was one of the sword and the shield. That we had the shield there to block off the forces, and then the sword was SAC coming in. We, the forces over there, were just a blocking deal. And our major strategy was based on the use of nuclear weapons in our tactical air forces. Since that time, there's been an indication that they would rather get into a conventional type of aerial warfare, and this bothers the European countries to the extent that they realize that if we try to do this in a conventional way, we are so outnumbered by the Air Force, we're so outnumbered on the ground forces, that we wouldn't have much of a chance, and this is making the European countries take a second look. I think that I think NATO has to stay in being. I think we have to have the confidence of the other countries, and I think we have to make them believe and know that if one of those countries attack, we're going to come to their assistance. And I'm afraid there was a time when there was a little doubt about this, and I'd like to eliminate that doubt.
Do you think that they're becoming very doubting as to whether or not they have enough word in what NATO will do? Do they have as much latitude as you think they should?
I can't answer that question. Actually, the United States forces are the heart of NATO. What they're worried about is what we're going to do. That's a difficult question. I can't do that.
Very good, sir. We'll go on to another. Could NATO forces oppose the USSR successfully in conventional war?
Well, if you would call opposing them for 2 weeks successful, then the answer is yes. No, I don't think they can. It's a question of numbers. It's if you're outnumbered at 3, 4, 5 to 1, you have to have something to make up for that numerical superiority, and that something is a judicious application of nuclear weapons. If you try to go the conventional road, you're going to be hurt.
You're speaking of tactical nuclear weapons here.
Right,
prior to
tactical nuclear weapons.
Utilization of any strategic. Does NATO have a role in limited wars and emergencies?
Well, the charter, the NATO charter, confines it to the European scheme of things, and if we're talking about limited wars happening on the continent, I can't foresee this. I could foresee a frontier skirmish, but to have a limited war of the nature of Korea, I can't see this without it expanding into an overall total NATO. In other words, I don't think it can be defined to the southeast corner of West Germany, let's say. I think it would expand out.
In July 1961, General Timberlake, you became the Deputy Chief of Staff, Personnel, Headquarters USAF here in the Pentagon, and a year later, the Commander of Continental Air Command. Perhaps we're not as familiar with CONAC's activities as we should be. Would you care to comment on this assignment in terms of challenge and interest?
Yes, I like your point about CONAC isn't familiarly known as some of the other major commands, and it's not, and that's one of the problems. If I may, CONAC is responsible for the training of all the reserves of the Air Force. This excludes the National Guard. This amounts to about 330,000 reservists. We have flying units, we have non-flying units, we have individual replacements, and so forth. I found that when I went down to CONAC that I myself didn't know too much about the reserve program. I was not familiar with them. I didn't understand their capability. And after being there a very short while, I found out that our reservists really are tremendous people. What most of the military doesn't understand is that is the nature of a reservist. In the first place, he has decided to be a civilian. As such, he owes his first loyalty to his employer and to his wife. At the same time, he is motivated to the extent he wants to donate something to the military defense of the country. And as such, he devotes what time he can. So many people make the mistake of thinking that a reservist is a full-time military man, and he's not. Not realizing this, then there's a tendency to either set up the requirements too high for the reservist or not making them realistic. I found that really the reserve flying units, for example, at the present time, 90% of the troop carrier units have a C1 rating, C1 or C2 rating, which is completely combat ready, and this compares favorably with the active duty forces.
Yeah, these people do it 1 weekend a month.
That's right, with the support of the Air Reserve Technician Program. Well, for the past several years, Continental Air Command and the Reserve establishment has been under constant attack. I suppose that we are the most looked at command in the history of the Air Force. I would hope that this would stop because the reservists themselves see this happening, this examination happening all the time.
Tends to demoralize them.
It makes them, let's say, less enthusiastic. And we've got such a tremendous potential here, an untapped potential, that I would hate to see it thrown away under any circumstances.
Well, what would you say, sir, has been your biggest challenge as CONAC commander? Getting it across that what these people are doing and what a tremendous job they are doing?
This, and finally, in my own mind, I reduced the major problem facing the reserves. The key word is utilization. The military forces, including the Air Force, have traditionally looked upon the reserves as a mobilization day unit, something to call in after an emergency. They don't look at the reserves from the viewpoint of utilizing them prior to an emergency, utilizing them in this period that we are now in, for example. Utilizing them to the extent that, for example, if we have a half a dozen Vietnams, those people that are going to fight those Vietnams are going to come out of the active establishment. Who is going to run the bases? And the reserves are people that can do this sort of a job. And there are hundreds of functions that the reservists can perform now prior to D-Day as well as after D-Day. This is the one thing that I've tried to get over, and it's a difficult job because, as I say, tradition looks upon the reservist as a M-Day organization.
Something to use when the fire breaks out. The firemen.
And I think you ought to use it, but I maintain that we're in sort of a war now. Why not use them? They want to be used. They're anxious to support the active duty establishment.
General Timberlake, how can the Air Force continue to obtain the best trained men? I'm speaking of the regular Air Force now. What's the best way to continue? I feel now that we are receiving well-trained people into the regular establishment. How can we best continue this?
Well, I think the idea of the pay and the housing and those things have been talked about so much that I can leave them unsaid. Now, but I think that another important thing is that the Air Force or any organization is going to attract good people by making those people proud of belonging to that organization. This, to me, the motivation of belonging to a concern that has the national interest at heart and the national defense, the national future depends on this organization. If you can build up at your organization that attracts people, you make them proud to belong in there, I think this is going to keep on bringing in the good people.
Do you think we're doing this now?
I think so, yes. I don't know, well, I should know, looking at that single bar on your shoulder, but in talking to the younger generation in the Air Force, they are absolutely superb, and they continue to be so, and they amaze me with their ability, their brains, their initiative, well, they're just great.
You mean this for the non-flying personnel, of course, as well as the pilots and navigators?
Definitely. For years, we had the idea that you had to be a flyer to contribute anything to the Air Force. Well, this is not true. You need the non-rated person, so to speak, just as much as a flyer to support him. And I think we're beginning to realize this more and more.
General Timberlake, do you feel that the Air Force should limit their people to training in a, excuse me, in a particular specialty? Or should we try to train our people in all aspects of the Air Force?
That problem has been going on in the personnel business for a long while, and I don't think anyone has a satisfactory answer. It's sort of like the doctor's business. Do you specialize or are you a general practitioner? I think, without doubt, there are certain functions in the Air Force, certain areas where you have to have specialists. In the research and development field, you must have specialists. On the other hand, I think if you don't broaden out and get some cross-pollination and training of an individual, or knowing how the other side lives, that we're not going to develop the all-around leaders that we should have. So I'll have to walk down the fence on that and say we should have some specialization, but our goal should always be to have a general military education for as many people as possible.
This best develops a leader, you think?
I think so.
Do you believe that the proposed Bolte legislation is the answer to the promotion problem in the Air Force?
Well, it's not the answer. It's the best answer we've seen come aboard yet.
Would you care to elaborate on specific portions of it?
Primarily, the promotion aspects. Most of the people don't realize that the Air Force is 2 to 3 years behind the Army and the Navy in the time of promotion. In other words, in the Navy, a man will be promoted to a rank equivalent to a major 2 years before they will in the Air Force. The Bolte proposal puts the promotion cycle on an equal status between the three services, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, which means an improved promotion cycle for the Air Force. Now, there are some defects in the Bolte proposal, but you're not going to get everything exactly to your liking, and if I had anything to say about it, I think I would like to see that proposal accepted by Congress and put into effect as soon as possible.
General Timberlake, you've told us that you believe that the reserve program is not being utilized to the point that it should be. How would you best improve it beyond giving it a mission?
First of all, I would do the obvious. I would find out in a very definitive manner what is the requirement of the Air Force for the reservist. How many flying units do they need? How many non-flying units do they need? How many individual augmentors do they need? I would establish these requirements, and then I would support these reserve units in exactly the same manner that I support the active duty. In other words, right now, in the past, we set too high a goal. We said we'd have to have too many units, and you just can't wishfully say, well, let's put a unit over here in Keokuk and expect to have a unit. You have to have the people, you have to have the people there, the ones who want to be in the reserves in order to make a unit. We've never made a finite requirement that what we need in the way of the reserves to support the active duty force so that we'll have a well-balanced military machine. This is the first thing I would do. And the second thing I would do, I would not treat them as they were stepchildren. I would give them exactly the same support as the active duty units.
Financially and otherwise.
Financially, from a viewpoint of equipment, I wouldn't just give them discarded equipment as we've done in the past. And if you did this, it would be remarkable the type of units that you would see grow up. They'd all be as good as our troop carrier units are right now.
What do you think's the best organization structure for managing this whole reserve picture, General Timberlake?
Well, I assume your question when you use this reserve management, you're talking about the reserves and the National Guard.
Yes, sir. How would you manage both of these most efficiently?
I'll answer this a little in an oblique fashion. However, it goes something like this. I believe it should be a maxim that any military organization should be organized in peacetime in a manner as closely approximating how it's going to be organized in wartime. In other words, there shouldn't be a great organizational change that happens when a war occurs. It would seem to me that if you had all of the reserve forces under federal control now, being assigned to gaining commands, knowing they're going to go to Tactical Air Command or MATS or ADC, that they would be familiar with this organization peacetime, and transition to wartime would be less. On the other hand, if you have half of your organization under federal control, such as your reserve units, and the other half under the 50 separate states, you are not living up to this maxim. Therefore, I think it would be best, if we possibly could, to have one reserve force, and I, for one, would like to see it under full federal control as a part and parcel of the Air Force in peacetime as well as in wartime.
You would have no National Guard?
No, I think there is a definite means for National Guard. We have to go back to tradition again and history. Part of our Constitution talks about the National Guard. There are many functions to be formed at a state or territorial area.
But as Army units as opposed to Air Force?
Army units, and there's some Air Force units, but I can't see how an F-105, which flies at about Mach 1.3 or something like that, can fly nonstop across the ocean. I don't see how that's going to help the governor of New Jersey quell a disturbance in Newark. I think this could better come under the control of the Air Force in peacetime.
Do you see any valid requirement for a governor having a transport aircraft under his control?
Yes. Although I don't see why he has to have a fleet of this. Now, I am not low-rating the National Guard. The National Guard has performed splendidly in Korea and World War II, the Berlin contingency, the Cuban contingency. They are a sharp outfit, and they are an excellent outfit. I simply say that the times have changed. We're not talking about the internal protection of a state, particularly using fighters or troop carrier units. We're talking about these are a nation's military power and not that of a state.
General Timberlake, going away from the reserve picture and going back to the overall picture, what are your views concerning the long-term communist threat?
I think the long-term communist threat is not going to differ a great deal than it is right now. I think that what we might see is that the communist threat is put out by the USSR as one thing. The threat between China and the USSR is something else. I would think that probably the USSR, and you can call them many things, but you cannot call them stupid. The USSR does not look for a major war any more than we look for a major war. I think that perhaps this might not be true of China 20 years from now. I think that this might cause a something, I don't know how to describe it, where USSR in Europe, the United States over here, are going to see perhaps a common enemy down here. And I think that USSR isn't necessarily going to stay in the same camp with the Chinese. However, the USSR, the communist threat, is going to continue around the world exactly as it is now, and these things varying from Vietnam's to Korea type of operations. And as long as we're willing to make a show and stop their encroachments in these areas around the world, I think as long as we do that, that the world will know that we mean business. I think that probably if this should continue for another 20 years, that the SAC bombers will never be called upon, or our missiles be called upon to attack Russia or vice versa.
The danger of general war is definitely receding.
I think so, for political reasons.
What are the most significant problems facing the Air Force today and in the future?
Well, they're many and varied. The Air Force has got to keep ahead of the world from a technical point of view. As I see it, the Air Force has, its mission might be a little expanded right now. I think if the Air Force would limit itself to a mission of manned operations in space, or anything which would lead to manned operations in space as one mission, and also the mission of man flying in the atmosphere, and then look toward research and development to get the best, go for quality rather than quantity in these two missions, get away from the ballistic missile delivery sort of systems, then I think this would narrow the Air Force mission, and we could be more specific in what we wanted to do.
Colonel Timberlake, do you believe the Air Force is a promising career for a young man today? And I'd like to add more to that. What advice would you give a second lieutenant who is commissioned today?
Well, I just went through this act about 2 or 3 years ago. My son graduated from West Point in '58. Of course, he wanted to get in the Air Force, too, and he did, and he is in the Air Force, and I didn't discourage him, naturally. I think if I were going to advise a young man going in the Air Force now, I would tell him to try to stay away from specialization, if possible. I would get a basic specialty, and then try to broaden my sphere, my outlook, so that I'd have more than just this one thing to do, so that I could make myself more useful to the Air Force, because I think you do if you can do many things. The Air Force, in turn, would say, well, here we have a young man who can do one of many things. He's more dependable. So I would say to broaden the vision, and don't get telescopic vision. The Air Force operates in a pretty large area, the sky, and I think the individuals that come in the Air Force should use that as their goal. Have a vision as wide as the sky.
Thank you, sir, very much.
Enjoyed it.